Many people in America believe that there is a genetic difference between African American athletes and white athletes that makes African American athletes perform better at sports like basketball and football. In this presentation, I will go over why that claim is untrue and present the reasons that I believe explain the overrepresentation of African Americans in popular sports. The debate about racial differences in sports has been going on since at least the late 19th century and possibly even before then. People looked at the dominance of athletes such as boxers Peter Jackson and Jack Johnson, as well as others such as world-class cyclist Marshall Taylor. There were many theories at the time that tried to explain their athleticism based on their race. However, a few decades into the 20th century, the debate simmered down due to segregation that pushed blacks out of professional sports. The conversation started again in the coming years due to outstanding performances in the Olympic Games by black athletes such as Jesse Owens. The question of black athletic dominance remained in people's heads for many years to follow, as people were constantly trying to come up with explanations. The debates have continued up to the present day, as many people try to understand the vast overrepresentation of African Americans in popular sports such as basketball and football. When I came into this class, I held the belief that blacks were just better at sports than white people. I had thought that there are genetic differences that makes black athletes better than whites because it was the easiest explanation for the vast overrepresentation that I saw in both pro sports and even in school sports. After taking this class, I think that there are other theories that are more valid for explaining this overrepresentation. One major factor is the accessibility of the sports that African Americans often participate in. Many professional athletes come from poor backgrounds where sports such as basketball and football are the only sports that are available to them. It is extremely easy to get involved in these sports compared to sports like baseball, where you need expensive gear to play. This explains a big reason why there is not an overrepresentation of African Americans in sports like baseball or lacrosse, since those sports are just harder to get started in for some people. Historically, African Americans have excelled in sports where they had ample coaching and facilities needed to succeed. In sports such as golf or tennis, these benefits have not been given to African Americans since they are often taught at private clubs that deny black people for economic or social reasons, which leads to an underrepresentation of blacks in these sports. Furthermore, there are many beliefs that are held within the black community that contribute to this overrepresentation. Sports sociologists have extensively studied the way African Americans think in terms of sports. An explanation that is widely held between sociologists is that African Americans value sports much more than white people do, which leads to a disproportionate amount of talented black athletes in some professional sports. A career in sports is often viewed by blacks as one of the only ways to move up into the higher levels of society, since they often do not have role models in other professions. Whites are much more likely to see role models and be given opportunities in a wide range of professions, which narrows down the range of occupations that black people are usually in. Finally, another big reason is the cultural differences between whites and blacks. For African Americans, basketball and football have become major parts of their culture, giving kids role models in the sport and drawing a lot of African Americans to play the sports. Sports like baseball and lacrosse, for example, are not nearly as common in the black community, which explains why there is not an overrepresentation of black athletes in these sports. Playing sports like basketball is very common for young African American kids and is a very social activity, as many of their friends are also playing. Since playing these sports is such a common and easy thing to do for African Americans in many communities, it can often lead to very skilled players in these sports. There have been many theories throughout history regarding this debate that try to explain this overrepresentation in terms of genetics. Some theories claim that African Americans have a genetic advantage through things like more muscle fibers, a projecting heel bone, or even better sociological makeup for some sports. These theories have generally been disproven, as they often do not hold very much scientific validity. This idea of African Americans being athletically superior is very common in America today. To counteract this, I believe that we need to highlight the amount of work these athletes put into their sports. This is something that is often brushed over in the media. Seeing the amount of work that African American athletes do goes against the idea that they are just genetically more gifted than white athletes. What surprised me most about this topic is simply the fact that African Americans actually do not have a significant genetic advantage in sports. Prior to this class, I was a firm believer that blacks were just better at sports than white people, because it was an easy explanation and I had never been told otherwise. This class has shown me that it is not genetics that causes an overrepresentation of African Americans in some sports, but instead, it is due to things like culture and common beliefs in the Black community. I'm very glad I took this class, and I hope to have a more open mind about similar topics in the future. Thank you.